Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. In Greece, Parliament has passed its new budget, passed legislation expanding its powers to privatize public utilities, and is cracking down on press freedoms. Now joining us to discuss all of this is Dimitri Lascaris. He's a lawyer called to practice in the state of New York and the province of Ontario, Canada. He was a securities lawyer in New York and Paris for a big Wall Street firm. He's acted on behalf of the Republic of France in the privatization of state industries and advised the Bank of Greece and the German Development Bank in numerous cross-border securities offering, and just recently was named one of the 25 most influential lawyers in Canada by Canadian Lawyers Magazine. And he joins us from London, Ontario. Thanks for joining us again, Dimitri.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
So let's start off with the budget. What is the headline there? So the point here is supposedly to pay back Greeks' debt, but is that going to happen?
At this rate, that is a virtual impossibility. We just step back and look at how we got to the current budget. There was an election over the summer, as you'll recall, and tremendous hostility towards the austerity program that had been imposed upon the Greek people by the Troika, which is essentially the EU and the IMF. And in the lead up to the election, there was a great deal of concern in the EU and in the IMF that the left-wing anti-austerity parties were going to prevail. And they were very blunt in saying to the Greek people, the Troika, that if that happened, there would be no further economic assistance from the Troika. And so a coalition of parties eked out a narrow majority. The dominant party in that three-party coalition is the New Democracy Party, which is a center-right party led by somebody named Anthony Samaras, an American-educated former business person in Greece. And he, with his coalition partners, recently presented their budget for 2013. And typically these budgets are overly optimistic, but if you take it at face value, it paints a very grim picture of where austerity is leading. The debt to GDP ratio is currently 165%. This budget predicts that the debt to GDP ratio is going to soar to 190%. Certainly an unsustainable level, but what's even more remarkable is the trajectory is sharply upward. The contraction in the economy is now envisioned to be in 2013 4.5%, as opposed to an earlier prediction by this coalition of a 3.9% contraction. Even a 3.9% contraction would be considered a very severe recession in any economy. 4.5% coming out as it does at the end of 6 years of severe contraction can only lead one to conclude that the current policies of the government are not going to generate growth anytime soon.
Now, the IMF target was something like, what, 120% GDP ratio debt to GDP ratio?
Well, this bailout, this so-called bailout, and the austerity program that constitutes an integral part of it aims to reduce Greece's debt to GDP ratio to 120% by 2020. I think that's a pipe dream. And that was a pipe dream even before the current budget came out. But if there was any belief in any quarter that that was something that was realistically achievable, it ought to be exploded by now. So clearly, the austerity program is failing. It's not achieving its stated objective. It's hard to believe that anybody in the EU leadership actually believes it's going to achieve its objective. And, one has to wonder whether the ultimate objective is quite different. And, there are a lot of people who believe, and I think quite rightly, that the real objective is to smash organized labor in Greece. And regrettably, that objective seems to be one that is being accomplished slowly and very painfully.
And perhaps another objective people have suggested that in the midst of this crisis, I've used this term, picking the bones of the skeleton of Greece. The privatization push is also an objective. So what is the significance and what happened about passing this new privatization legislation?
Well, it was, I think, portrayed as being something that was procedural and that ought to have passed with relative ease through Parliament. It barely squeaked through, despite the fact that the coalition government does have a majority. The key feature of this law is Article 2, which reverses a previous requirement, a long-standing requirement, that the government maintain something called a golden share in certain key state-owned enterprises, which include the port of Piraeus, the main port in Greece, the water companies of Athens and Thessaloniki, which are the two largest cities in the country, the Hellenic Petroleum Corporation, the Postal Service. With respect to all of these state-owned enterprises, the government was required to maintain a golden share. And this is something that really dates back from the privatization program of France in the 90s. And the essential concept is that the government maintains a stake that is sufficiently large in the enterprise to have effective control over its management. Now that might mean 50% or more, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. If the shares of the corporation are widely held, a shareholder holding something in the range of 20, 25%, perhaps even less than 20%, can effectively control the direction of the corporation. So this law relieved the Greek government of the obligation of maintaining a golden share in these strategic enterprises. So now it's conceivable that the government, if it can find a buyer within the horrific economic conditions that currently exist within the country for some of these entities, it could do so. It could sell these corporations without maintaining any control whatsoever. And you imagine when you're dealing with something, for example, as the water supplies to the largest cities in the country, it would be desirable, to say the least, for the government to have a very significant degree of control over how those companies are operated. We saw what happened in Bolivia years ago when the government tried to privatize the water industry there. Water became unaffordable to a lot of people. There was an increase in the poverty rate. And a lot of people, I think, rightly fear that may happen here if the government succeeds in selling some of these strategic entities. Right. No degree of control whatsoever.
And what's happening in terms of the press?
Well, this sordid tale dates back to 2010 when Christine Lagarde, who was then the finance minister of France, handed to the person who was then the finance minister of Greece a list of 2,000 wealthy Greeks who had Swiss bank accounts. And this list was mysteriously lost by the finance minister. It came to the attention of the public several months ago that the finance minister had been handed the list. At that point in time, Venizelos, who's the leader of the PASOK party and whose party had been in power at the time that the Lagarde list was handed over to the Greek government, produced a USB stick containing the 2,000 names. Didn't really explain adequately where it had come from, but didn't reveal the names of the persons who were on that list, and said that nothing had been done about investigating those persons because their identities had been obtained illegally, which is a highly controversial proposition in and of itself. But putting that aside, what then happened was a gentleman who was an editor of a Greek magazine called Hot Docs was provided a copy of the list and published the names on that list, and it became apparent that a number of politicians were on that list, shipping magnates, other significant business persons, and within 48 hours, this individual, Kostas Vaxavanis, was arrested and put on trial. His trial commenced within 3 days of his having been arrested, and this was done despite the fact that no one whose name was published on the list filed a privacy complaint, and it's extremely rare in Greece that there's a prosecution in circumstances of that nature. In addition, his trial is ongoing at this time, but in addition, there was another scandal involving two journalists of the ERT network in Greece. They criticized mildly a minister of the Greek government for failing to have investigated allegations that police had tortured certain persons who had been arrested in the course of demonstrations against the Golden Dawn Party, which is an extreme right-wing party that's gaining popularity in Greece. And when they criticized this minister for failing to investigate these allegations of torture, and as I say, the criticisms were not particularly harsh, they were promptly suspended and were replaced by two individuals on their daily program who are perceived as having a more favorable perspective towards the government. On Tuesday of this week, there was a strike on the part of journalists, in large part because of this perceived assault upon press freedoms. And so what you have in Greece really is an economic situation that's spiraling out of control. The government, purportedly to address the economic hardships, adopting a privatization program which threatens to give complete control over key state industries to private actors, and an assault on press freedom all at the same time. And in the face of all of this, the EU has remained, I think, remarkably silent, particularly in regard to the assault on press freedoms. And, when we go back and we look at the whole purpose for which the EU was ostensibly established, it was as a bulwark against fascism and to enhance the prosperity of citizens across the continent. Exactly the opposite is now currently happening. Fascism is on the rise, particularly in Greece. Democratic institutions are being eroded, and the periphery is being cast into depression-like conditions. And so the very basis upon which the EU and the euro in particular were sold to the European peoples has been completely undermined.
Thanks for joining us, Dimitri.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.